Hey guys, James here and welcome back to my channel. Today I am in the Mazda CX-5. This is the newest version, the one that got refreshed for 2022. In the US, the CX-5 costs about $4,000 more than the CX-30 when you match them as closely as possible for trim level and equipment. What do you get for that bigger price tag? In what ways does the older but more recently refreshed CX-5 hold its own against the CX-30? Well, let's hit the road and find out. One of the first differences you'll notice is that the CX-5 has a much more mature, more calming driving experience. This pavement is really terrible, and what you notice is that in the CX-5, the NVH character has a lot less of the higher frequencies. The whole experience is just a bit more luxurious, a little bit more calming than in the CX-30. And a lot of people have made a big deal out of the fact that the CX-30 has a torsion beam rear suspension, which is kind of regarded as a low-cost, simple, antiquated way of doing rear suspension, whereas the CX-5, which is an older model, has a multi-link independent rear suspension. In the corners, I have to say that the suspension sophistication in the CX-5 does show. It's a lot more planted over really rough pavement like that. Not only is the rear suspension more tied down and more stable, the front suspension also feels a lot more solid than the front suspension in my own CX-30. As part of the CX-5's recent update, Mazda strengthened the CX-5's unibody and they revised the suspension. So I think both of those sets of changes really pay dividends when it comes to the ride over really rough pavement. On the flip side, the CX-30 is definitely the spunkier car. In the CX-30, you can feel very distinctly that the front and the rear tires are working really hard and working equally to keep the car on its path. You actually feel the MX-5 Miata DNA when you corner in the CX-30, whereas you don't feel that at all in the CX-5. In the CX-5, you do get that sense that that front end is washing out sooner before the rear end even feels like it's working very hard. Oh, cool, nice. We have a sideshow here with a G35. Yeah, no wonder insurance rates were so high when I got my G35 back in the day. Another aspect of the CX-5 that I think is better than in the CX-30 is the transmission and throttle tuning. This was another area that Mazda addressed in the refresh, and again, I think their efforts really show. One of my biggest complaints about the CX-30 is that the transmission often feels like it's confused and indecisive when you really put down the hammer. The CX-5's updated transmission programming solves the issue. This transmission now feels very responsive. It feels like it does what you want it to do. And on top of that, the CX-5 also has slightly different gear ratios in third and fifth and has a shorter final drive ratio. These changes make the CX-5 more natural to drive when it comes to throttle and transmission tuning. The CX-5's name of the game is refinement, and the CX-30 is a bit more rough around the edges, but it is more spunky if you want a more energetic driving experience. So do you want calming or do you want energetic? If you want calming, the CX-5 is going to be the better choice for you. This next advantage of the CX-5 is probably the most obvious one, and that's its size. But it's not just the size per se, it's also the way you sit in this thing, the way it makes you feel. In the CX-5, you have more space everywhere, in basically every dimension, right? Headroom, shoulder room, hip room, leg room, cargo space, you name it. And in fact, the cargo space is 50% bigger than the cargo space in the CX-30. That's a huge difference. You also sit a lot higher in the CX-5. I do get the sense that I'm in a proper SUV. And the greenhouse in this car is a lot bigger as well. So I'm sitting higher up, I have more window, which means I just have much better visibility in this vehicle than I do in the CX-30. Because the CX-30 is so heavily based on the Mazda 3 hatch, the way you sit in it also feels a lot like you're sitting in a sedan or a hatchback. Your body is spread out a lot more horizontally rather than sitting more upright. Overall, the CX-5 has a lot more usable and comfortable interior space if A, you like to schlep around a lot of junk, or B, if you and your passengers are of medium height or taller. Another quality of the CX-5 interior is that everything feels slightly better built in here than it does in the CX-30. Now, to be sure, the CX-30 has the much more modern and sleek design on the interior with better tactile feedback in the switchgear, and it's just a wonderfully aesthetic place to sit. But when I interact with the CX-5, I do get the sense that things are just a little bit more cushioned, a little bit heavier, more dense. So the CX-5's interior space feels higher quality in a more old school kind of way, whereas the CX-30 feels slightly lower quality, but has a beautifully updated design. And the final thing I want to point out between the CX-5 and the CX-30 is the fuel range. One of the biggest complaints that I have as a CX-30 owner is that the gas tank is too small. Nominally, it's a 12.7 gallon tank, and after you account for a bit of fuel as reserve, then it's effectively a 10.5 gallon tank. So we get about 280 miles between fill-ups. Over here in the CX-5, we have a 15.3 gallon tank, which translates to effectively 13 gallons. You should get about 320 miles between fill-ups. That's a 15% longer fuel range in the CX-5. Now that 15% difference sounds kind of trivial, but trust me when I say it's not. The slightly longer fuel range is a welcome difference. So let's sum up this thing. The CX-30 is a beautiful, fun to drive little CUV. In one of my early videos on the CX-30, I called it a mini Porsche Macan, which I still think is accurate. But for an extra roughly $4,000, the CX-5 is no slouch either, and it has some real advantages. Between the CX-30 and the CX-5, I think it basically comes down to this. If you want the more refined, more comfortable, more spacious, more luxurious experience, the CX-5 is going to be the choice for you. And one last note, I've briefly test driven the CX-50, which is the supersized version of the CX-30, and my initial impressions are very positive. I think it's another knockout design, and it seems to have that calm, soothing driving demeanor of the CX-5. And so as soon as the CX-50 is available on Turo in the San Diego area, I will rent it and I'll make a video to compare it to the CX-30 and the CX-5 for you guys. Thank you so much for sticking with me until the end. I really appreciate it. If you liked this video or found it entertaining, if you could hit that like button, that would be awesome. It really helps out this growing little channel that I've got going on here. And also hit subscribe so you don't miss any of the videos I have coming out. Thanks again for joining me today, guys, and I will see you in the next video. Drive safe.